This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. The Guardian of London once wrote, "There's just a handful of living composers who can legitimately claim to have altered the direction of musical history, and Steve Reich is one of them. He was one of the pioneers of the composition style which became known as minimalism, and his colleague John Adams credits him with inventing a similar technique called phasing, a form of counterpoint produced when two or more instruments play identical repeated material at a given time delay. Steve Reich's compositions have blurred the lines between pop, jazz, classical, and world music, and he's influenced a generation of composers working today. His own influences include not only teachers like composers Vincent Persichetti, Luciano Berio, and Darius Milhaud, but also his early training as a drummer for jazz and dance bands, his studies of Balinese gamelan, African drumming, and Jewish cantorial tradition. Reich wrote 3 movements in 1986, and it's one of only a handful of pieces he's written for full orchestra. Like a lot of his other works, it has a spatial element as well as a sonic one. The rhythm instruments, 2 marimbas, 2 vibraphones, and 2 pianos, are in front of the conductor, not in their traditional place at the back of the stage, behind the rest of the orchestra. Because these instruments play constantly and supply the ongoing rhythm of the piece, placing them directly in front of the conductor enables the full orchestra to see and hear one unified rhythm direction without any time delay. In the orchestra itself, there are actually 2 string sections divided equally. This was to help listeners hear each group more clearly, especially in the opening pulse section, when the changes in harmony alternate between the 2 groups, slowly overlapping. As Reich says, like the changes in light as clouds move across the sky. The 3 movements of the piece, fast, slow, fast, flow from one to the next without pause. The tempo of the slow movement is exactly half that of the first movement, and the final movement picks up the tempo of the opening one, which begins with what may be the most important element in any composition by Steve Reich, the pulse. The remainder of the opening movement gradually moves from pulse to melodic patterns. And the transition is so smooth that it's hard to say when the pulses end and the melodic patterns begin. The second movement is a quotation from Reich's 1985 Sextet. With oboes and clarinets playing the parts that were taken by synthesizers in the earlier piece, along with vibraphones, bass drum, and low strings and winds. Eventually, the woodwinds and violins fade away. And the accompanying instruments, vibraphones, bass drum, and low strings and winds, become the new melodic focus. The finale uses material from both the sextet and New York Counterpoint from 1985. The upper instruments establish a two-part canon, one line following the other in phase. The lower voices begin to accent these lines so that you hear it first as 3 groups of 4 beats each, and then as 4 groups of 3 beats each. This kind of rhythmic ambiguity has always been one of Reich's signatures. Eventually, the finale becomes what's called a mensuration canon, in which the subject appears simultaneously at 2 or more speeds. Here, the subject is a rhythmic pattern found in West African music. As the piece nears its end, the canon moves upward in pitch until it leaves the bass behind and finishes in a high A minor. Steve Reich turns 80 years old in 2016. Given his prestige and his influence, along with his age and awards like the 2009 Pulitzer Prize, he is arguably the dean of American composers. In fact, Michael Tilson Thomas calls him America's most important living composer. 3 Movements is in many ways archetypal Reich. Melodic elements come and go, some for short phrases, others longer, but at its heart is always the pulse, the rhythm, slowly changing and evolving towards a deeply emotional conclusion. This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.